Good evening, Des Moines. Welcome to the Doc and Lefty program here on webcast1live.com. We're sitting in the plush, always verdant studio, webcast1live.com studios in the well-heated and well-accoutrement Skywalk in downtown Des Moines. We're here. This is the Doc and Lefty program. We're here every 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. on Tuesdays, and so we thank you very much for joining us. I'm flying solo again. I thought that I could keep him chained, but Doc had something come up today. He said, I got to go. I'm going to fly the coop. You take care of business tonight, Lefty, and I would really appreciate if you gave me a shout out on the show. So, Doc, wherever you are, all points between here and there, we do miss you and hope that you are able to come back next week in fine form and ready to rumble with your good friend. Well, with us today, you might not have heard, folks, but the big news all last week and into this week, as fitting a man of his stature, was that Nelson Mandela, the great South African leader, freedom fighter, first black president of a divided country after reconciliation, has passed away. He was 95. And with us in the studio today is a very special guest. Was, in full disclosure, he was my constitutional law professor my first year of law school at Drake. He is the James Madison Chair in Constitutional Law and the director of the Constitutional Law Center at the Drake Law School, Mark Kende. Mark, thank you so much. Professor Kende, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thanks so much, Blake, and you should call me Mark now. You're a big time lawyer.
It's well, my waistline would suggest the big time is okay. The rest of it, I'm still. That's why they call it practice, I think. But the reason I have Professor Kende on the show tonight, folks, is that, and he was the first person I thought of when I'd heard that that Mandela had passed away. Professor Kende has a very special connection to South Africa. He's a constitutional law professor here in Drake, one of the top guys in his field, and traveled to South Africa in 2000, the spring 2000.
Spent the whole year of 2000, right?
The whole year of 2000 in South Africa as a Fulbright scholar, studying the South African Constitution and kind of hobnobbing with all the folks that put that document together. And I believe that was finalized in the mid-90s, like 95-ish, I think. Is that correct?
Well, 96 was finalized. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So right there, I mean, if you can imagine, if you will, if one of you had been able to kind of sit with the folks that framed our own Constitution in 1793, just shortly 1794, just shortly after that document had been prepared, and you get to actually talk to guys like James Madison or Patrick Henry, I think, was probably involved in a little bit, maybe not in the actual drafting process, but those founders of our nation, Professor Kende got to do that, and so I asked Professor Kende to be on the show to talk about his connection to South Africa, his thoughts about Nelson Mandela as a leader, and some of the political and constitutional questions that swirled around him for an awfully long time, and discuss, and I know we were talking before the show that you're not a trained historian, but we'll talk about some of the history that a lot of you folks would know just from it being, probably the most famous guy in the second half of the 20th century, I would imagine, that everybody knows, and that maybe some of the nuance that a lot of folks are missing in some of the coverage over this last week. So, Professor Kende, I guess I've introduced you to a little bit, but maybe discuss a little bit more specifically your connection to South Africa. You went on as a Fulbright scholar. Talk about some of what you did, some of the work that you did while you were there.
Sure. So when I was a lawyer, before I went into teaching, I was a civil rights lawyer in Chicago, and I was always interested in racial justice issues. So when I went into teaching, I got the opportunity to go over to South Africa, and I knew they were basically in the process of constructing a constitution and then trying to implement it. And I thought, what could be a more amazing experience than to see how this country tries to overcome this history of racial injustice that, was astounding in terms of the brutality that went on. So I spent the year there in 2000, and as you already mentioned, got the chance to talk to a number of people who drafted the Constitution, got the chance to talk to even some of the Constitutional Court justices who President Mandela appointed, and talk to them about how do you implement a constitution in a country that has a history of brutal apartheid? How do you implement human rights sort of out of thin air? How do you make this document real? And that was the fascinating question that I was really struggling with and trying to learn more about.
Well, so in 2000, if I it's hard to parse all the information you get from when somebody like Nelson Mandela passes away and all the media coverage is dominated with his life and his times. But I believe when he was released from prison, it was 1990, and then he stood for election in 1994.
Right.
And then served 5 years, I believe.
Exactly.
And so you were there the year after he didn't look to get reelected.
He was that rare African leader. Unfortunately, by unfortunately I mean too many leaders in Africa try to stay on, but he was that rare leader who said, one term is enough. He served with a vice president who was white and who had been the leading member of the National Party that had implemented apartheid as part of the compromise. And then he was replaced by Thabo Mbeki, who was another member of the African National Congress, a guy who was known as being more technocratic and sort of more, I guess, less sort of easy with people and more of a sort of thinker. And so I was there the first year or second year that Mbeki had taken power. And so the transition was quite extraordinary because although there was a loss even then in having Mandela leave office, here was a peaceful transition in a democracy in a country that had not seen democracy at all for so many years.
Now, I believe Thabo Mbeki's successor was Jacob Zuma, the current president right now, or is there one in between?
There was sort of an interim in between, and then, yes, Zuma was sort of the next president. He is the current president.
Right. And so we've seen the ANC has dominated electoral politics almost obviously.
Yes.
Because Nelson Mandela was the most famous leader of the African National Congress.
Yes.
And so I guess what I'm interested in is from a constitutional perspective, what's the let me start over. Our Constitution in this country is held up with this sort of, in my opinion, this almost meta world reverence. It's almost biblical, right? And that's not to offend any of our religious friends in the audience, but it's meant to say we almost think of the founders of our Constitution as these mythological characters that kind of handed this down to us from on high. Now with such a young Constitution, I would expect that not to be the case in South Africa. But with a transformational figure like a Nelson Mandela at the heart of it, how do the South Africans, from your experience, approach their constitution?
So I think you're right in both ways, actually. It's not viewed as a biblical document because it's too new and there are too many questions about how will these rights and other provisions be implemented, and what about poverty, and what about AIDS and crime, and those things are still around even with the new constitution. But at the same time, I think it's viewed with a great deal of respect. The process of enacting the new Constitution was an amazing process involving the election of a constitutional assembly that was democratically elected, as well as an amazing public campaign. They went out into the most rural parts of South Africa and convened meetings of tribal groups and had those groups provide input into the process that was then taken back, to the Capitol to discuss things. So I think there's a great deal of respect for the document, but there are questions as to the document in terms of the reality of its promise. And because it's so new, those are natural questions. Those are going to have to be there. Whereas we sort of know that we've done a lot of great things in this country. The document has lasted pretty well. We're having some questions now about how it's lasting at this point in our politics. But so there are some differences there, but some similarities too.
Let me ask you this question: You're an expert at the United States Constitution. Well, what I would consider an expert of the United States Constitution. You spent a lot of time in South Africa studying their Constitution. You wrote a book that you brought with you, "Constitutional Rights in Two Worlds: South Africa and the United States." It's a comparative piece, sort of talking about constitutionalism in two countries. And if I remember from the constitutional class that I took, not the con law class that all one else take, but the writing class that I took with you, the comparative. I can't even remember the name of the class.
Comparative constitutional law.
Yeah, comparative constitutional law that I took.
A plus.
Hey, I wasn't graded on my memory, folks. I was graded on how well I handled the material. But if I remember correctly, the constitutional principles between the United States Constitution, considered a first generation constitution, South Africa, would they be considered? What kind of constitution is the South African Constitution?
Sure. So they started off and they basically had the elites, the people who led various groups, and they adopted 34 principles. And then among those principles and among the purposes was to have the elites also come up with a temporary constitution, which is very unique. And then the temporary constitution was meant to serve for a period of time until this elected constitutional assembly that I mentioned earlier could get elected under the temporary constitution and then could create the final constitution. So at first glance, it looks like a process totally different from ours. But actually, it's not, because as you know from constitutional law, we had something called the Articles of Confederation.
That's right.
That was not meant to be a temporary constitution, but it was our first constitution. It didn't last. It had problems. So that's a different story there. But then that led to a kind of crisis that led to the convention that resulted in our final constitution. So there's actually an interesting similarity there, although obviously differences as well.
And how closely did they look back to our Constitution as a template or as a guide or as a lodestar that they could draw experience from?
I think South Africa, more than almost any country in the world, tried to survey as many constitutions as existed and tried to figure out what would be the best constitutional model for them. And this is not meant in any way to be disrespectful, but the strong presidential model that the United States have and the emphasis on sort of liberty as sort of the main goal was not probably consistent with the South African focus, which was to have not a strong dictator or a strong president because they'd just been through apartheid, and more of an emphasis on equality rather than liberty because they just been through this brutal discrimination against blacks. So what ended up happening is their constitution is modeled more after Germany in terms of the parliamentary structure and Canada in terms of human rights. But they looked a lot to the U.S., scholars, and they had conferences that were very important. But on this particular issue, their constitution is a parliamentary model based more on Germany and Canada than on the U.S.
Well, that's very interesting, and we're going to talk more about South Africa, its constitution, Nelson Mandela's role in it. After this break, stick around with us. We have Mark Kende as our special guest for the entire hour. Very fortunate to have him. So take a look at our sponsors, and we'll be right back.
Bertroche and Associates will provide you with a friendly, caring, and confidential place to find help for mental health concerns. We are ready for your call. We are proud to work with military personnel and their families. Our doctor, Dr. J. Patrick Bertroche, provides a full range of psychiatric services for children, adolescents, and adults in a forthright and informative manner while maintaining a casual, comfortable, and relaxed atmosphere. Our licensed mental health therapists provide individual counseling to children, adolescents, and adults, including couples and marital counseling. Visit our website at bertrocheandassociates.com for more information or call 515-334-9484. Our offices are located at 5525 Meredith Drive in Des Moines, just east of Skate North off Merle Hay Road. Isn't it time to talk to someone? Take care of yourself and your family. Contact Bertroche and Associates.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We are here with special guest Mark Kende, constitutional law professor at Drake University, my old con law professor, not to say old as in your age, but old as in it was an older time in my past. So we're very thankful that he's here to talk about South Africa, the passing of Nelson Mandela, and some of the issues for South Africa going forward. And a little later in the show, I'll be gauging Professor Kende's prognosis for the country, where it's been, where it is, and where it looked like it's going into the future. But now, in the first segment, Mark, you talked a lot about, you mentioned a couple of times apartheid and the legacy of apartheid, and that's sort of inextricable influence, the ubiquity of its influence in the constitutional system in South Africa. Could you describe for some of the folks that may not watch the news or may not remember the 70s and 80s what apartheid was and Nelson Mandela's particular role, like why he is who he is today?
Sure. So apartheid really became what's called grand apartheid in the 40s. It goes way back. And the basic idea was to treat blacks and other groups within South Africa who were actually majorities. This is what's extraordinary. You had a very small, relatively small white minority that had achieved the power to be able to suppress and subordinate blacks and other groups. These groups were not allowed to live in certain places. They were not allowed to travel. They had to carry passes. They were not allowed to work in certain ways. And candidly, those who were politically opposed to the regime were often treated with great brutality, were hunted down, assassination attempts. One of the Constitutional Court justices actually survived an assassination attempt when he was not yet on the court and when apartheid still existed. Nelson Mandela emerged as a leading figure of what was called the ANC youth movement. The African National Congress had a youth movement with several prominent people. One was named Walter Sisulu, and another named Oliver Tambo. And these three kind of became very, very, very aggressive defenders of African rights.
And we can talk about aggressive defenders in sort of the actual context. We think of Nelson Mandela as this saintly sort of grandfatherly figure because he came out of prison at such an advanced age, but in his youth he was how he would describe himself, a less temperate person. And maybe talk a little bit. He was a freedom fighter, wasn't he?
He was a freedom fighter. He was a rabble rouser. He started off as a lawyer, but became, as I said, very, very quickly involved in this movement. The most interesting transition in his career, though, came at a point where the ANC, for a while, tried to be relatively peaceful, kind of following the Gandhi nonviolent resistance, and then decided that was just not going to play. That would not be successful. So they established a military wing called Spear of the Nation, and they made Mandela head of Spear of the Nation. And when Mandela wrote his autobiography, it's actually one of the more entertaining parts of the biography because he basically said, no one was less qualified to be the head of the military wing of the ANC than me. I'm not a military man by nature, but I realized at that point that we had to take on these military forces that were killing our people. And he defended his role by saying, first of all, you couldn't leave your people helpless and let them be brutalized. And secondly, they would only use their military force against South African security. They would not go after white citizens. And that was the line they drew. So he became the leader of their military wing. So we think of him now as this almost grandfatherly figure who emerged from prison and was all about reconciliation. All of that is true, but from what I understand, the first 10 years in prison were very difficult for him, and he still, I think, had a lot of this sort of militaristic quality, if you want to call it that. Sure.
Now, I heard a quote on the BBC that is attributed to Nelson Mandela. I don't think that I heard it or he gave it in a recorded speech. There are very few early recordings of anything that he did. The famous one that they have been playing over and over again is his trial in front of the Afrikaners court in South Africa. But there's a quote that's attributed to him where he says, in comparing himself to Gandhi and Martin Luther King, says, for Gandhi and Martin Luther King, nonviolence was a principle. For me, it was a tactic. And I think if you could speak to, I'd like to hear you speak to some of maybe the differences in what he was facing as opposed to what they were facing, why nonviolence for Gandhi and Martin Luther King would have been a more principled stand, and for an individual like Nelson Mandela, why it was more of a tactical decision that he made and then could just as easily kind of withdraw from.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And there is a contrast. As you just pointed out, he did embrace the use of military force at a certain point. And I think, candidly, he was not willing to allow his people to be treated in the brutal fashion that they were. People were murdered. Political figures who were trying to get people to think about democracy were brutalized. The government repeatedly lied about it. Tanks were brought into shanty towns. And I think at some point, there is a possible split, and maybe nonviolence is an option, but I think it would be very hard to see something like that go on and on and on, over and over again. And I would say it's hard to compare in some ways. Some of the water cannons, let's say, you see when you see resistance in the south of the United States, and you say, well, water cannons are bad. And there were murders that occurred during the civil rights movement, so I don't want to deny that. But nothing on this sort of massive scale. This was, I guess, what you might call segregation on steroids. This was almost a form of slavery, was really what was going on here. So
sure, and I hear a lot of the civil rights leaders who are being interviewed to provide a historical link between our civil rights movement in the '60s and Nelson Mandela's struggle. And I think, and not to sit here today and talk about any movement's particular legacy, because both are very important. And the civil rights movement in America, they certainly faced a lot of challenges. They had a leader who was assassinated, and a lot of terrible things happened. I wonder though if the point, especially in South Africa, you had a small, and if you could maybe speak to the population difference, who was in power and what part of the population did they actually represent?
Yeah, let me mention one other thing though that you might find of interest, which is Gandhi started his legal career in South Africa. And Gandhi was a leader of the Indian resistance movement in South Africa. There was a big Indian community there, and so Mandela would say that he very much was aware of and drew on Gandhi's work, but at some point decided, he had to move in a different direction. In terms of your question about population, you had really approximately 10 to 15% of the population, the Afrikaner whites, who were controlling pretty much the rest of the country. There were also English whites right. who had English backgrounds. So there was this split. And the general view was that English whites were not as pro-apartheid as Afrikaner whites, that this was more a product of Afrikaner culture. Afrikaner culture is fascinating also because one of the pathetic excuses used for apartheid was that Afrikaners had been oppressed historically. And while that's very much true, of course that is a very bad justification for then going out and oppressing other people. So It was amazing to see, and they were very good at what they did. They had good security forces. They had support from certain nations, including at certain points, unfortunately, the United States and England. And, so population-wise, he did have the advantage of knowing that if he could activate the majority, at some point, the time would run out on the Afrikaners. And that's also a difference in terms of the racial situation there and the racial situation in the U.S., where blacks are the minority.
And they were the minority even in the South at the time. There were large populations in the South, but they were the minority. And I wonder if continuing even to 2013, I remember a conversation that I got to listen to between you and Richard Goldstone, one of the constitutional he was a justice, I believe, in the Constitutional Court in South Africa, and was involved in the framing of the Constitution at the time. He came to Drake and gave a talk, and I remember a question he got from one of the people in the audience said, how can the whites sort of just accept they had all the political and the economic and the proper everything. They had everything. How can they just accept this extreme affirmative action that happened afterwards? Not extreme as in bad, but extreme as in it was written into the law,
into the Constitution
in such a way that it's not here in the United States. And his response, I thought, was really telling. He said, because the whites felt guilty, and that I don't think that happens here in this country. And I don't know if you have a view on that at all.
Yeah, I think it's been fascinating to watch white reaction in South Africa. You really do have different groups, and I think people like Goldstone, who I would fall on the side of, I guess you might call a slightly more progressive political outlook, were very much willing to think that this is something that has to be done. You have to transform the society that oppressed blacks for so many years by now giving blacks opportunities, by figuring out ways to implement a constitution that has some socioeconomic rights provisions in it, which is quite unique, housing, education, etc. There are, however, to be candid, some whites who've not found it to be a comfortable transition. So there was a problem with brain drain. Some whites have gone to Australia or New Zealand. There was one white I remember the story of that I always found interesting. He went to Oregon and he wanted to work as a mechanic, and he actually didn't like it very much, went back to South Africa and has now found quite a career there and is quite happy there and is quite now tolerant of the black government because they haven't come after him the way he imagined in his worst fears they would. So there's a lot of different views in the white community, but I think in general, whites have some realistic knowledge that what they did was horrific, and therefore there has to be some payback. What's remarkable is the payback has not been violent. The payback has been political and social efforts to improve the situation. And there is a high crime rate, but it's not been systematic political violence, and that's partly due to Mandela.
Well, with that, we're going to take another break, but we'll come back. I have a follow-up question on that point. We're with Mark Kende for the entire hour. Please listen to our sponsors. They help keep the lights on here and provide us with the forum to have folks like Professor Kende here to talk about South Africa and Nelson Mandela on the week after his passing. So check out these sponsors, webcast1live.com, and we'll be right back.
All across America, there are countless numbers of people struggling with addiction and other life-controlling issues. Probably someone you know and love. There is a way out. There is hope. Transformations Treatment Center in Delray Beach, Florida, has a unique approach to substance abuse treatment. Call now and ask about our Guaranteed Success program or log on to transformationstreatment.com. Transformations. Change your life. Change your relationships. Transform your world.
Whether you're 10, 25, 50, 80 years old and beyond, everyone needs to live within their means. I'm Tom Coates with Consumer Credit of America. For almost a quarter of a century, we've helped people of all ages learn to manage their personal finances to benefit them far into the future. When problems arise, we've got the experience you need to make those debt problems go away. Got financial problems? Call Consumer Credit of America.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. This is Lefty with Doc and Lefty. Doc is out, but congratulations, folks. I've heard your deafening silence when I bring on musical guests, and Doc's absence has been received. And so we have things that people want to talk about, guests that people want to listen to. My good friend and one-time Professor Mark Kende is here to talk about South Africa and Nelson Mandela in the wake of his passing. And if you want to call in with a question for me or for the professor, the phone number is going to flash at the bottom of the screen. It's 855-244-0077, or you can, post something on our Facebook page, or just, how to get a hold of us. And maybe Doc will send in a text message or something about some questions that any of you guys might have. But Professor, I've been struck by some of the history here, and I'm going to throw out some names for you. From some of the post-colonial history of Africa, which is very important to the South African legacy and Nelson Mandela's legacy. Robert Mugabe, Muammar Gaddafi, I'm losing the really brutal dictator who died in the 70s, and I can't remember
Idi Amin?
Idi Amin, yeah, yes, Idi Amin. I can't remember. These were men who started off like almost exactly the way Nelson Mandela started off, fighting against some of the post-colonial legacy when Britain and the Dutch and the French, everybody kind of started pulling out of Africa. And yet they persisted. They held on to power. What was it about Nelson Mandela that kind of split him off from some of that and provided him with this universal legacy that he's going to enjoy now on into eternity?
Well, I think a couple of things. One thing is that he really is a Democrat. I mean, he really believed in the ANC and democracy. In fact, one of the things that isn't well known is for years, the African National Congress, when it was even contemplating the possibility that it might eventually get power, did not favor a Bill of Rights because, as you know from constitutional law, bills of rights restrict the power of the majority. And so I think, I certainly can't read anyone's mind, but the bottom line is that I think in the long run, he knew that for the country's betterment and for the party's betterment, there had to be a continuation, that he was not and could not become the party. That's really what's happened in these other countries, like Zimbabwe with Mugabe. These leaders become the party. They have a cult of personality, but it's achieved in this way almost artificially. Mandela may have a cult of personality, but it's precisely because he didn't want one. He spoke about not wanting statues and things, even though, of course, he must have known that there were going to be such things. So I think he brought with him a humility. I can't speak again for his psychology, but he came from a rural background, but a rural background of nobility. And sometimes people who come from a background of nobility, because of that, have a humility. Sometimes they don't. They have just the opposite. But he didn't need that to build his self-esteem. He had self-esteem from the point where he started, from his background. I think a sense of who he was. And he was not a dictator. And he was, however, I do want to say, a strong politician who had strong views and who had a spine of steel. For sure. But he was not a dictator in terms of his approach to things.
Well, and so this, and that was a question that occurred to me in one of the first segments was, here we have Nelson Mandela, the Democrat, and as I learned from numerous classes at Drake, democracy and constitutionalism are opposed to each other, fundamentally opposed. Maybe could you explain? I won't participate, folks. I'll have the expert explain why that is, because in this country we synonymize constitutionalism, democracy, everything. If it's constitutional, it's democratic, and vice versa. But that's not the case, is it?
Well, it depends on how you use the terms, but in the sense that democracy means majority rule, and that most constitutions, by contrast, have a Bill of Rights that protects the rights of minorities. That's where you have the potential clash. Now, a lot of folks, myself included, think a good democracy has to have a Bill of Rights because you don't want the majority to run amok. But absolutely, there is this distinction between just letting the Democrats and the Republicans, whoever's in control, do whatever they want. And what we have is this system that doesn't do that. What South Africa has is a system that doesn't do that. And in that sense, you're right on point, and this is something I think a lot of people mistakenly think, that is democracy and constitutionalism are one and the same, and there's a real tension between them.
So how would you reconcile a Democrat, someone like a Nelson Mandela who was striving for the majority, being such a key part of the constructing of one of the most comprehensive, restrictive from a liberty standpoint, I would say. I mean, there are limits on there is guaranteed housing in the South African Constitution. There are limitations on what's available and what you can and can't do with respect to housing, if I remember correctly. So was that a light bulb moment for him, or was that something in his character? I don't want to have you psychoanalyze him, obviously, but
sure. So one thing I think that's important is his role in the constitutional process of the actual drafting was somewhat limited. He was, the leading political figure on top of things. But having said that, I think from his perspective, he knew that for blacks in South Africa to succeed, they needed whites. And it's a terrible thing in some ways to say, given the brutality that had happened. But this country couldn't go forward if all the whites left, if there was brain drain. And so he and the ANC, African National Congress, came around to the realization, although it took many years, that there had to be a Bill of Rights. It had to protect some of those people who even had perpetuated the most horrific acts, to make sure that they didn't have horrific acts perpetuated against them. But even that, I would say, is part of, in the long run, promoting a multiracial democracy in South Africa meant that there had to be this sense of security among people. Now, there was some pushback. There were some within the African National Congress who would have liked a more radically democratic approach. But I think in terms of bringing about reconciliation and allowing a society to exist where blacks and whites you can see them together on television. There have been all these shots, in the recent days of the funerals and the memorial service. I think in the end, he realized that you couldn't just, dismiss other groups. And so I think, you could argue he did that for selfish reasons in terms of his community, or you could argue he did it for the country as a whole. But either way, I think it was a very good thing. So how do you think and you've been there in 2000, you've been back several times since 2000. What is the white view of Nelson Mandela? Is he universally loved, or is he a more nuanced figure in his home country? I think he's a more nuanced figure, but I think I can't speak for everyone I met, but I certainly think that many whites were surprised. Think of the media propaganda that existed during the apartheid regime. During the apartheid regime, he was portrayed as the worst form of terrorist whose sole goal was to basically wipe whites out. He was also portrayed as a dedicated, devoted communist. He was portrayed as evil from the get-go. And then the day of his release, there's this grandfatherly, gentle man who comes out and within a short period of time talks about reconciliation. So I think a lot of whites feel a sense of gratitude. They feel good fortune. Some probably don't deserve it, but I think they were very lucky in that respect. Having said that, as we talked about earlier, certainly the new Constitution does do some things to try to make sure that there is redistribution of wealth in the country, because a lot of that property and land that whites own was stolen. And so there are things like that in there. But I think in general, most whites I met felt a sense of relief and good fortune. And then there were those whites who just simply still believed that it should be an apartheid regime. And those people you just have to write off. They're not going to change their mind.
Sure. So we'd hinted a little bit earlier in the show about some of the troubling international relationships that the apartheid government was able to maintain throughout its history. The United States was not an exception to this. How closely was... But I don't think that the United... And correct me if I'm wrong, but the United States was never an actual political ally necessarily of the apartheid regime, or were we at some points?
Well, it depends on, I don't want to sound lawyerly, but it's part of my habit, I guess. Depends on how, define the term, right? But let me say this. During the later years of apartheid, particularly when Reagan was president, on the one hand, Reagan seemed to do things that supported the white regime. He did not want to cut off economic relations. He did not support the sanction movement and the divestment movement that was taking over American colleges and universities. On the other hand, he did appoint the first black ambassador to the country. Some people within his party started to realize that Mandela was not the evil demon he had been portrayed, but in fact might really be a hopeful possibility to negotiate with. So I think we have, on the one hand, a somewhat shameful part of our history, whereas, he was even declared a terrorist up until 2008, sort of accepting the South African propaganda. But on the other hand, particularly then after Reagan, when you have other people involved, things changed. We became more active in the divestment movement, and the country's politics changed, and we found them to be a far more unacceptable partner and far more strict. And with that, we went along with a variety of United Nations resolutions that said that. So I think we have a little bit of dirt on our hands that we do have to acknowledge, but I also think in some ways we did some very important things that made this change possible.
How would you explain? Would the end of apartheid have happened if the Soviet Union had? This is a narrative that has been coming up more and more frequently, because I want to spring on our listeners this sort of this connection that comes out of thin air, but you hear a lot about how the communists were allied with the ANC, and that was a big reason why we didn't want to get involved with them. But if it wasn't for perestroika, the end of communism, a lot of people are arguing that the ANC would never found legitimacy, because the United States would never granted legitimacy and sort of, blessed it as the United States is wont to do. Is that something that you've thought about or?
Oh, very much. So The United States was under the misimpression that the African National Congress was a communist puppet, and maybe that was partly due to effective Afrikaner propaganda. The reality is that, sir, there were some communists who had ANC affiliation, and it's true Mandela was willing to work with communists. But let's be really candid. He wasn't willing to work with them because he bought into communist ideology. They were one of the few groups of whites who were willing to work with blacks. He was a pragmatist. He was a politician. In some ways, maybe more of a politician than some of the other figures, Gandhi and King that we've talked about. And so as a politician, I'm very, very, very much of the view that this is one area where people have just gotten it wrong, which is to think of his communism as in somehow, or his connection to communists, as anything more than a pragmatic realization of here's a group of whites who can help our group. In fact, one of the leading figures who resulted and helped cut the constitutional deal that took place that made the whole new constitution possible ended up being, ironically, the leader of the Communist Party. So that's one thing I think it's important to get right, is that he may have had connections there, but they were pragmatic. In terms of the Cold War, you are absolutely right. The Reagan administration and previous administrations had defended their willingness to work with the apartheid regime on the grounds that, look, they're anti-communist and Mandela's a communist and connected. As I said, that's the wrong assumption, and that's where they really made a tragic mistake. And had they been willing to say that Mandela is not a communist, had they been willing to fight for the freedom of blacks, ironically, that might have provided the avenue for the ANC to not turn for support to whoever it was that would give them that support. It's one of the great tragedies, I think, of the American relationship with South Africa.
Was there evidence to the contrary that, in fairness to, I'm going to get a lot of emails from conservatives trashing their patron saint. I get to say that. That does not reflect my guests' personal views, so direct all criticism my way. But was there evidence to the contrary that the United States missed, or were we deceived? Were we duped into supporting this racist? And it's weird to call a government racist, folks, but this was a racist government. This is a government founded on a principle of racism and oppression, which is really unique in modern society. There aren't very many governments that have done that so blatantly and so proudly as the South African apartheid government did. But what did we miss? What was out there that we could have latched onto?
I mean, I think the bottom line is South Africa's apartheid, the really only analogy in some ways in the 20th century is Nazi Germany in terms of an overtly racist regime. And we shouldn't have missed that. I mean, we should not have missed that. In terms of what was going on, the bottom line was, I think, strategic concerns overtook moral principles. And the strategic concern in the United States was, above all, to win the Cold War and beat the Russians. And if there was a belief, which there was, that the South African blacks were associated with the communists, and they were also engaged, supposedly, according to this story, mischief in other parts of Africa, they were fighting in Angola and other places, that if we had simply understood that maybe they were engaged in a connection with communists because of the fact that they weren't getting connections in other places, and our government was still doing a lot of economic business with white South Africans, and had that changed earlier, things might have changed.
It's interesting that you compare Nazi Germany to the apartheid government in South Africa, and I wonder, the apartheid government was a long-running concern. Nazi, the Third Reich, what was from 1930 to 1946 or whenever, the end of the war, 39 probably, when I don't remember. I'm not a trained historian either, so forgive me on the dates. I'm going to have World War II vets really get after me after the show. But was it easier to identify the evil of Nazi Germany because we were able to personify Adolf Hitler? We had Adolf Hitler as the...
No, and I don't mean to say that, South Africa wasn't trying to take over the world, and Nazi Germany was. I don't mean to say that they're equal. What I do mean to say is, in terms of overtly racist regimes in the 20th century, South Africa and Nazi Germany really are almost alone in that regard. And obviously, South Africa wasn't trying to take over the world, but you would think that given the history of what had happened with the horrors of the things that occurred under Nazi Germany and what the effect is of that racism, that we would have been more sensitive to moral considerations and the moral evil of what was going on there, instead of giving into strategic considerations, which, while certainly relevant, I think in the end probably weren't actually things that even were good for us strategically.
Could our own history of segregation have kind of made it easier to buy into some of the Afrikaner propaganda?
Yes, and I mean, candidly, there were Afrikaners and whites in South Africa who made that point, that, who are you guys to sort of be preachy with us? You're just barely through your period of this, and, there's still racism in the United States, and sure, I think that was part of what made it difficult. Candidly, you had a white regime there, and you have a predominantly white regime in the United States for years. And the South Africans were very effective at saying, we're doing things better. So, for example, they created independent homelands, quote unquote, called Bantustans. Right. And then said, look, we're providing freedom. Now, these were, in fact, in the worst parts of the country, the people who they put in charge were blacks who were pretty much puppets of the apartheid regime. And they tried to do all sorts of things to make it look less evil than it was. But I don't think it would have taken a rocket scientist to see through it. And I think there were many people, usually, of certain kinds of political persuasions, who did see through and who did argue for far more vigorous activity against the regime early on. But the powers that be were not willing to abandon trade and other strategic interests.
It is a shame. Well, we're here. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to be back, talk to Professor Kende about some of his thoughts about the future of South Africa and how it's been an example to a continent that has been really... Some parts of it are moving in the right direction as far as economic development and equality for its citizens, and some, tragically, are moving in the exact opposite direction. So we'll be back right after this break. You've been listening to Doc and Lefty on webcast1live.com.
Petrosian Associates, how can I help you?
Bertroche and Associates will provide you with a friendly, caring, and confidential place to find help for mental health concerns. We are ready for your call. Our doctor, Dr. J. Patrick Bertroche, provides a full range of psychiatric services for children, adolescents, and adults in a forthright and informative manner while maintaining a casual, comfortable, and relaxed atmosphere.
All across America, there are countless numbers of people struggling with addiction and other life-controlling issues. Probably someone you know and love. There is a way out. There is hope. Transformations Treatment Center in Delray Beach, Florida, has a unique approach to substance abuse treatment. Call now and ask about our Guaranteed Success program or log on to transformationstreatment.com. Transformations. Change your life. Change your relationships. Transform your world.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Thanks a lot for sticking around with us. We have the James Madison Chair in Constitutional Law, Director of the Constitutional Law Center, my former constitutional law professor, Mark Kende, with us at the Drake Law School. He's also the author of Constitutional Rights in Two Worlds, South Africa and the United States, and that's available in fine bookstores everywhere. It's also reissued in paperback, I believe. We're going to give you the Doc and Lefty bump on that, and I'll probably buy a copy, and you'll see your sales go up by 1.
Exactly.
As a result of this show today. So South Africa has been lauded over these last 13 years since you were there as sort of the shining light in Africa. Economically, the economic powerhouse of the continent. It really has been. What are and I think rightly so, a lot of the credit has been given to the Constitutional Congress, to Nelson Mandela's first and only term, and the political and economic reforms that were put in place after he was released from prison and subsequently elected. Is the country great? Now, we've touched on it a little bit, but what's the current state of affairs, and what's your view going forward in this week after his passing?
Well, I think there was a lot of promise, and there have been some real wonderful developments in terms of economic growth, job opportunities, and increasing black middle class, better housing. Having said that, I have to be candid and say that right now, within the last several years, I think there's been an increase in pessimism. Let me explain several reasons why. So we're now many years into ANC governments, and with each ANC government, hope rises. And unfortunately, despite hope rising, the level of problems, which is mainly the remnants of apartheid, still exist. There's still huge poverty, horrible crime rate, a huge AIDS problem, and still too many people who simply can't get into the middle class or don't have the skills to do so. And then what's really, I think, made things bad recently is the level of corruption. So whenever you have one party that's dominant, South Africa's been called a dominant party democracy. So you have the ANC, they always win the national elections, they always score almost 2/3 of the vote. There's a real corruption problem because basically the only way to get things done is to have ANC support. And the corruption, unfortunately, many people feel is widespread among some government officials. And this is one area where Mandela was so different. You know, there was just no doubt that this was not a guy who was corruptible. And that sent a message, and that sent a sort of feeling about the country that it was going in the right direction. And with Mr. Zuma, unfortunately, he's had 2 court involvements that were quite messy. One involved accusations of corruption that eventually were dismissed under questionable circumstances. And another time, he was accused of rape and he was acquitted. And so there are real concerns right now I have about the direction of the country. I still want to be hopeful. I still think the country has moved in the right direction in many areas. But my sense of the country right now is that unfortunately we're seeing an increase in pessimism there. And although it's still probably doing better in terms of democracy than almost any other African nation, or maybe more than at least, maybe there's a couple that are doing as well, I don't think right now things are going in a way that bodes well for the country, and that concerns me.
So it's perhaps most certainly unfair to score a life, but you're a professor, you're used to handing out grades. What grade would you give Nelson Mandela for the political work that he did after he was released from prison?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, as a person and as a leader and as a figure, you have to give him an A+ overall. As a political leader. As president, I don't think you can give him an A+, but I'm not so sure that's his fault. I mean, imagine being the first man to come out of prison, be president, and then you also have to work with your adversary in a coalition government, which was how the thing was structured initially. There's only going to be so much you can do. And, candidly, he only stayed in office for a few years. I think that's a good thing in terms of democracy. But again, to build a legacy, you need a lot of time. So I'd give him a very high grade. I don't know which grade I'd give him in terms of his politics. I'm going to be a bit evasive. But as a president, I think I would give him a very high grade, but not so much as I would as a sort of inspirational and sort of revolutionary and political leader in a bigger sense. And it's particularly with regard to reconciliation. I think with regard to his ability to take a country that we have to be honest, was on the brink of a civil war that would have resulted in the death of millions. There were protests in the street. Millions of people would have died. And, we don't like to think that there's this one-person theory of history, that one person is everything. But the reality is, without someone like Mandela and without Archbishop Desmond Tutu and several figures like that, this country would have gone down the tubes.
How much credit would you give? Actually, I'm gonna start over again. I apologize. I was asked this question today when I was talking about having you on the show, and it was something that I hadn't thought of. And the question was, how much credit should F.W. de Klerk get in all of this Nelson Mandela coverage for the state of the country coming out of his imprisonment? So I'd pose that question to you.
Sure.
I have my own thought, but I'd pose that question to you.
Well, look, he got the Nobel Peace Prize, and he was willing to compromise, and he was willing to work with someone who had been portrayed for years as pretty much an evil demon. And so I think he deserves some credit for that. Having said that, there's certainly some bitterness among African blacks in South Africa and otherwise that, for example, he would get the same Peace Prize that Nelson Mandela would. There's a feeling that he did what he did out of practical necessity because he knew the way the wind was blowing and that eventually blacks were going to take over the country, that he acted out of self-interest as opposed to acting out of more deeply moral, altruistic reasons. So does he deserve credit? Absolutely. Is he in the same league or category as Nelson Mandela? I don't think so. And I will say that I have more than a few friends who, when he talks in a beneficent way about Nelson Mandela, have a really hard time listening to it.
I'm sure there's some, if we had the Daily Show back in the 80s, they would have found some clips of him being less than favorable. I guess I see, and as a child growing up in the 80s, I don't remember a lot of the demonstrations, because that's when it got the hottest, was 1980 to 1989. That was when it was really, really ramped up, and it was hot the whole time. But that's what I remember from
there were
last
demonstrations in the streets.
Yep.
There were horrible incidents involving the police, although there were horrible incidents involving the police even back in the 60s.
Right. So the Soweto massacre and everything, that was in the 50s, I guess, that started the whole thing.
Right. So but there was. I mean, imagine how long a history of horrible incidents involving a security force that is. It got very hot. And I think, candidly, de Klerk saw the writing on the walls, and that was part of what motivated him. Having said that, you got to give the guy some credit because there were a lot of people in his party who certainly wouldn't have been willing to do that. And even some of his immediate predecessors would not have been willing to do that. And that still would have meant the possibility of all-out civil war.
And I think that's absolutely right. And his direct predecessor was the hard line to end all hard lines.
Yes.
I would guess, in my opinion, I would give him the credit, the same sort of credit that Mikhail Gorbachev is owed for his role in ending the Cold War. I think that he was a hardline communist who saw the writing on the wall and realized that it was unsustainable, and that was just sort of. I don't think that he was a capitalist by any means who, here's this guy Ronald Reagan that I need to be friends with. So I think that in the annals of history, those two are, in my mind, are somewhat equivalent. What would you say? South Africa, not only as being the economic example, is also this Truth and Reconciliation example for the entire world. The Truth and Reconciliation Commissions went on for several years, I believe.
Right.
And I remember Richard Goldstone talking about some of the testimony that he heard. horrible, horrible things were disclosed, and horrible things were admitted to by Afrikaner security forces in the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, is that's been a model that's been unsuccessful elsewhere around the world. What about South Africa was unique, and Nelson Mandela's role in those commissions, I think he called for them even, that made them work in South Africa to the extent that they worked at all, and not work in other parts of the country. I think that they had them in Rwanda that were not as successful as South Africa.
Well, this is why I love South Africa, because there's something about the people there. It's not just Mandela who was willing to embrace reconciliation. I can't explain this, and I'm glad I can't in some ways, but there is something about millions of South Africans who were willing to not forget, but to at some level forgive. And it's a rare thing, as you point out. In many other countries, efforts like this have not been successful, although I want to give a little credit. The TRC process actually, believe it or not, has its origins in Latin America, which has seen its share of horrific dictators run governments. But so I think it's the influence of Mandela, Archbishop Tutu, the people they picked to be the sort of commissioners who heard the testimony, the sincerity of some of the people who committed these acts that were horrific, the willingness to forgive of some of the people who had horrible acts committed against them. As I mentioned, the Constitutional Court Justice who was almost assassinated, he had his arm blown off, but he was willing to forgive the security officer who blew off his arm after that security officer testified truthfully in front of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think it's a remarkable thing about this culture and this country, which is why I love it and why I'm still hopeful about it, because there is this element, and I don't want to generalize about a culture that's very complex, but there's an element of South African personality and community and that embraces an ethos. A term that gets used, and you may have heard the term, is Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is a term that means roughly social harmony and trying to achieve social harmony and trying to bring back even people who, have done horrible things. And that ethos is pervasive in this country. There are certainly exceptions. There are criminals there just like any other place. I'm not sure why it hasn't worked in other countries as well, but I think there is that lack of ethos. There is more of a vengeful motif. And so, it's just a good fortune. I will add, though, there are people in South Africa who don't think TRC process worked as well as they would have liked. People who saw their relatives murdered or brutalized. Some of them are bitter about the fact that the people who did that were granted amnesty, and some of them feel like the reparations they received were not adequate. So the TRC is interesting, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because in some ways it's more popular outside the country than inside the country.
Do they subvert justice to a degree?
Well, there is a conflict, because one of the bottom lines of the TRC process is that if someone went through it and was granted amnesty, the person who they victimized could not bring a lawsuit against them. There was no access to justice if people wanted to get into the court system. And there was actually an early constitutional court case. See, you can't keep me away from the cases completely.
No, that's okay. I need a pinpoint site, though, so I can go and look it up later.
But in that court case, they said, at the end of the day, international law normally requires a remedy for a human rights violation, but a domestic constitutional provision such as this involving the TRC in this kind of a context can trump that. And they did recognize the legitimacy of the process, in part because it did provide reparations for those victims, so they weren't going completely without.
So it only got about a minute left. What is your big picture legacy, Mandela, South Africa, and its wider reach into Africa and even into other troubled parts of the world?
I think Mandela's an amazing model of what we would like a leader to be. He was someone who put, I think, his country and human rights and principles first, although he was also aware of the fact that you have to use politics effectively to do that, but he was willing to work with people he didn't agree with and he didn't like. I think if we had a world in which more political leaders were, instead of demonizing their opponents, willing to work with them or try to come up with constructive solutions, try to be forgiving, and try to celebrate the importance of peace and reconciliation, we'd all be better off. And I think especially in Africa, where so many of the leaders, unfortunately, have stayed on too long, if they would depart and allow others to take over, it would also promote the democratic goals that he had.
Fantastic. Well, we're at the end of our hour. I want to thank our guest, Mark Kende, the James Madison Chair, Constitutional Law, Director of the Constitutional Law Center at the Drake Law School. my old stomping grounds, and certainly a professor that I really enjoyed learning from. His book, Constitutional Rights in Two Worlds, South Africa and the United States, from the Cambridge Press, is out. You can Google it. I'm sure that you can buy it anywhere books are sold. I want to thank all of our sponsors today. I want to thank our producer, Ryan Northfield, for his great work in the booth. And Preston, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation. We'll be back next week. Doc will be back. And we'll be bringing more of our local and international perspective to you all. So thank you so much for listening to the Doc and Lefty program. Join us back here on next Tuesday, 6:30 to 7:30, and we'll see you then. Cheers.
Hi, I'm Representative Tom Shaw, and I love these guys, both of them.
Love these guys. Get over here. Get over here. Love both of them.